Welcome to Beyond Talking Points from Little Visionaries Bookstore. I'm Bridgitte Jackson-Buckley, and today I'm speaking with Penny Wittbrodt. Penny Wittbrodt is the mother of 3 grown kids and the grandmother of 4. She and her husband, Don, enjoy life in the beautiful bluegrass state of Kentucky. In August 2012, nurse Penny Wittbrodt was rushed to the emergency room after the mysterious onset of severe respiratory distress. Her husband raced to the hospital and within minutes stood and helplessly watched as she stopped breathing and was placed on life support in a medically induced coma. Over the next 2.5 years, that scene inexplicably replayed itself over 18 times. Penny is with us today to share her story of her near-death experience. Welcome, Penny.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm so excited to speak with you today.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. We were talking just about the different interviews and stuff, and so I love the different styles of the people who interview me.
Oh, fun. Okay, so you've had several near-death experiences. Okay, so I am curious, what was your view? Did you even know about near-death experiences before you had one? Like, were you a person of faith?
Yeah, I was, and
Okay.
I wouldn't say I was, I wasn't in church every week. I kind of was church hurt and kind of out of the church scene because I'd had some bad church experiences as a single mom, and I knew about near death experiences, and it's funny because it didn't occur to me until after that I knew about them because my mother had had one and I had completely forgotten about it. And when we were kids, my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer. I want to say in June. They thought she had a bad gallbladder, and I think this was in 1978 or 79. And she was gone by the 4th of July, and it turned out she had liver and pancreatic cancer, and just when they opened her up, it went crazy. But my mom was really, really struggling with it as the youngest of her children. And she was out one day and she was mowing the lawn. And we'd come home from school and we were watching cartoons. And she came in, she looked weird. And she said, when daddy gets home, tell him to come into the bathroom. And I'm like, okay, so we just kind of ignored it like kids do. And um, my dad comes home and I said, Mom says to go into the bathroom. And then I hear kind of this thud and my dad screams and we go running and he's carrying her lifeless body out of the bathroom onto the bed. And he's telling me, call an ambulance, call an ambulance. Well, back then we didn't have 911. And so I'm looking through the phone book at 8 or 9 years old. What 8 or 9 year old
Wow.
could even do that today? And I'm
Wow.
I'm trying to find the phone number. We've got a rotary phone. I'm trying to dial it. I drop the phone. My dad gets mad and yells. He's like, just go get your aunt who lived, I want to say 7 or 8 houses down the street. So I get on my bike and I'm riding down there. I get her. She'll kill me for telling this. She's laying on her belly, laying out in the sun, and she's got her top of her swimsuit undone. So she doesn't have strap marks on her back. And I'm like,
Of course.
yeah, mom's dead. Mom's dead. And, of course, Aunt Betty jumps up and I'm like, oh my goodness. So she's holding her suit on, running down the street, keeping up with the bike at that. And the paramedics come in and they're doing CPR. They get her onto the gurney. They're wheeling her out the door and she wakes up and she's screaming, that the sun's burning her. It's setting her on fire. So she'd had a heat stroke. And I think her temperature was 106 something when they got there to get her. And so she coded again in the ambulance and floated above herself. And they continued CPR and got her back. And she was so upset because she said it was so painful to be in her body while she was having this heat stroke. And here she had gotten out of it and was watching what was going on in the ambulance. And then they pulled her back in and she was upset. But she never got higher than the roof of the ambulance. And I had just completely forgotten that. And when I had told my mom my story of my near death experience, she was like, oh, okay. And I thought, wow, that's a fantastic story for someone to tell you to have that reaction. And I thought, well, I wonder if she doesn't believe me. And then I had written it for a book and I finally said to her, you had a near death experience. Do you remember that? And she said, no. And I said, do you remember when you had the heat stroke when grandma was in the hospital? And she said, oh, yeah. Yeah, I did. But I don't know. I guess maybe since she just popped out of her body and didn't go any further. She didn't carry it with her for very long. And it was weird because my grandma like called us on the phone after she died, and I picked up the phone and she's like, Penny, it's grandma, is your mom there? And I hadn't, as a little girl, hadn't really accepted that she had died. So I was just like, Mom, grandma's on the phone. And she took the phone and she started shaking and her color went white. And she said, Mom. And she looked at me and she said, which grandma? And I said, Grandma Patrius. And then I guess the line went dead and she starts yelling at me. She's like, who was that? Who was that on the phone? I'm like, it was Grandma Patrius. That's who she said it was. She asked for you. And it was just the weirdest thing. And I
Okay,
don't,
so let me make sure that I'm clear. So your mother had a near-death experience, but you didn't recall that, or you didn't discuss it with her until after your near-death experience.
yeah,
When you were a child, you did have, we'll say, an esoteric experience with the non-physical because your deceased grandmother, you heard her voice on the phone, but
yeah,
mother did not hear her voice.
yeah. Well, she heard it. It was just distant. And that's when she kind of went
Oh,
white. And it was funny because the phone rang and I picked it up. And I
oh,
remember it
wow.
sounding like a bad connection, like it was real staticky. And I was like, hello, hello. And she's like, Penny, it's grandma. Is your mom there? And I was like, yeah, hold on, mom, it's grandma. And she just assumed my grandmother down the street. And yeah, and then she heard it and she remembers that to this day. She's like, yeah, I remember her calling us on the phone.
Wow. Okay, so your mother, so it sounds like she didn't see it as a near-death experience.
I
So
don't think so.
just to make sure that we're all on the same page, how do you define a near-death experience?
Well, to me, the fact that you are aware of yourself outside of your body that isn't doing what your body is supposed to be doing, so you've had that I guess that technically is just an out of body experience. And then near death would be going on to the other side and deciding or being sent back, one way or the other, where you have
Mhm,
this interaction with the divine. And I guess,
mhm.
hers stopped short of they were able to get her back just as she popped out of her body and back in. So
Got it.
that's probably, better termed a out of body experience
Yeah,
involving death, because she actually had
yes,
flatlined.
because
So
they are defined differently. OBE, out-of-body experience, and near-death.
yes,
You had a major near-death experience.
yeah, that I was not expecting.
Okay, so can you talk to us about the events of that night that led to your first near-death experience? You were having an allergic reaction, which is, gosh, like my children have allergies and we've never experienced anything like that, but it's like you don't really see how severe allergic reactions could be, but they can really be
Oh yeah,
threatening.
quickly, and it's funny
Yeah,
because I had since my teen years, I'd had an EpiPen with me because I had an allergy to shellfish, but
yeah,
I'd
we have
never
those.
used it. And when I had the EpiPens as a kid, my cousin had one too because she's allergic to bees, and you had to draw it up. Then you had a little case that had a syringe, a glass syringe in it, and then the little glass vial, and you would have to draw it up if you were to have a situation, which I suppose I could have done, but now it's just that little jab,
Hmm.
and I'd never, I mean, I'd had allergies, I'd had asthma, but I'd never had been in the hospital with any of it. And it was all well controlled with just your standard medications. And so I had had surgery on my neck. I was working in an ICU step down unit for patients that were on ventilators or had like serious wounds that were going to require longer than Medicare would pay for them to be in acute care. And so they would come to us and we would get them off the vent, and we had this one patient. He was an eye doctor and totally lucid, and he had we didn't know that no one told us that he had a history of being violent, that he'd been violent at the hospital, he'd been violent with his wife their whole marriage. And our charge nurse didn't, I guess, feel like it was important to tell us that he had knocked her down on the day of admission in our daily safety meetings. And so we were in there and we were going to put a deep line in his neck. And so we had a doctor coming up to do that, and he was bringing his nurse and I was assisting. And so I was in the room, and we had his bed down to the floor because he kept getting up and we didn't want him to fall. And then a mat on the floor in case he rolled out of the bed. Well, we had him in a recliner for the procedure. And so I'm in between the two, which I never would have done if I would have known he was aggressive, because you don't ever block your way to the door. And I was just walking him through it as another medical professional, which generally is pretty minor, right? And I said, they're going to put this drape on you, and you're going to feel something cold as they clean off your neck, and they're going to give you a little numbing medicine, and that might burn a little. Just walking him through it, holding his hand, and he's fine. And the doctor gets everything set up and goes to give him the lidocaine injection, and he just bolts up and he says, "I don't consent to this," and he punches me in the face. Well, I fall down between the bed and the chair, and because the bed was so low, I couldn't push myself back up. And so he just comes over and keeps punching me in the side of the head. He knocks the instruments out of the way, hits the doctor. The doctor can't figure out how to unlock and move the recliner. So he's just on me. And finally, a tech across the hall heard the whole commotion, and she came running over and undid the chair and pulled it back. And I got up and finished my shift, of course, because we're nurses. And he said, I'm not going to have to pay for your injuries, am I? So he knew what he'd done. And the next day I got up, and when I went to turn my head, my vision went black. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's certainly not normal. So I called, went in, got seen. And I had broken my wrist, torn my rotator cuff, and they thought that was it. And then a couple months later, so that was in August and November, I saw neuro, and they said, you've looks like you've ruptured the discs between C4-5 and C5-6 in your neck, and had to have surgery that week or that next week, within a week. And so I was home recovering from that, and
Wow.
had this huge tall neck brace on, and it's the hard plastic one. I think I might have been out of that one by then, but I'd made us smoothies, just strawberry smoothies. That was it. No allergies to anything like that. And I had made my daughter, she went out onto the porch. I made mine. I went out onto the porch, and it was just this normal day. We were watching people, cars driving in and out of the neighborhood, and, kids playing and stuff. And I just started feeling really odd. Like, I don't know, like kind of itchy under my skin, on my neck and my mouth. And I'm like, wow, that's weird. And like maddeningly itchy, not just a little. And then I noticed I was drooling. And I'm like, what did, and then I thought, okay, I'm having a hard time swallowing.
So it was the smoothie.
It was something, well, no, that's what we thought though. Apparently this surgery, they had used either, or maybe both, bone glue and cadaver bone. The injury was worse than they thought, and they actually had to mechanically put my spine back together. And the discs had blown up into the spinal canal. So I have permanent nerve damage. And, from this, I haven't worked since. And we think that's what it did. We think that triggered this mast cell activation disorder, which your mast cells are part of your allergic response. And some people will have a disorder in which those things are triggered in a huge way, like in an anaphylactic way, even though they're not exposed to anything. So I could be sleeping and it would happen. I could be just sitting reading a book and it would happen. We could be out to dinner and not have gotten our food yet, and it would happen just out of the blue.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and it's usually a terminal diagnosis, usually within, if it doesn't spontaneously resolve in 2.5 to 3 years, then you just die from it. But mine resolved. So, but yeah, I'd had that whole thing kick in, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, do I need to take an EpiPen? Surely not. It seemed like a huge, bold thing to do. And I thought maybe some Benadryl, and I went into the house, and then I was really having trouble swallowing, and I could hear myself wheezing. And I thought, okay, there's no time for Benadryl. So I did the shot. My son pulled into the driveway with the van right then. And I said, hey, we got to go to the hospital. So he took me to the hospital. And I don't remember what happened to him. I guess he was in the waiting room. I don't know. But I got kind of shoved aside. And the nurse that was there when I was there, I knew, because I had helped expand their ICU. It was just a little hospital. And I walk in, and I'm, breathing like this. And she's like, okay, what's the problem? I'm thinking, I know you, I work here, and or had worked there. And she says, I told her I was having an allergic reaction, anaphylaxis, which is, you go ahead of everything. I mean, even heart attacks, you go ahead of heart attacks because those go so quick. And she said, well, you took your EpiPen. Why did you come in? And I thought, oh, wow, this isn't going to go well. So she puts me in a wheelchair, puts me in a long hallway away from everyone while we're waiting for a bed to come to the room. And I rebound, so the epinephrine generally will stop it, but it didn't. I kept rebounding. And so I start drooling again and having trouble swallowing and having to look straight up to breathe. I give myself my second EpiPen. And finally, a doctor heard the breathing because it's really loud. It's called stridor. It's squeaky sounding. And she heard it, and she stuck her head around the corner, and she's like, oh my gosh. And she runs down the hall, gets the wheelchair, pushes it into the room.
So
And
you went in, and then, I mean, it's standard to go to the hospital after an EpiPen.
everyone should go to the
She
hospital
didn't
after an
check you
EpiPen,
into a room. You were in a wheelchair pushed down the hall.
because they were waiting for a bed for that
Oh,
room.
okay.
And I'm like, I
Okay.
don't need a bed. We got to move, And she's like, no, we have to have a bed in the room. And I'm like, but no. I mean, I even worked at ER. We take code call in the ICU. So if there's a code, we would go down and work codes. And so I know the procedures in the ER, but I'm not well enough to argue with her. And so
Right.
when they finally took me to the room, I'm a bad IV stick anyway, and I was worrying about that the whole time. And all my veins had gone flat because I'm anaphylaxing. You're going into shock, and they couldn't get an IV in. And she's like, "We got to get her across to trauma." And I thought, "Oh, great, I'm going to get intubated." And so they ride the cart across the hall to trauma, and we get in there, and they get just this tenuous little IV, and like half of it sticking out, and they're pumping Benadryl and steroids and giving me epinephrine shots in my arm. The others were through the IV, and it would hold me off for 15, 20 minutes or so, and then it would start all over again, and it would be worse and it would be faster. And so finally my husband gets there. We were engaged at the time. He gets there, and he looks at the doctor. He has no medical experience. He says, "You need to do something. She's going to quit breathing." And the doctor says, "No, we've got plenty of time before that happens." And to me, it seemed like it was just seconds, but he said it was probably a couple minutes after that. And he said, "You just looked up and you collapsed." And I just popped out of my body right at that moment. I heard the code call go off. I saw the people rush in, and kind of as they were rushing in, kind of pushing him out into the hall. And I saw him lay the bed flat and put the compression board under my back. And
Was there a feeling when you left your body?
I don't think so. I just suddenly noticed I wasn't in there, and I didn't know who that was. I remember looking down at her and thinking, "Oh wow," and hearing the code call and knowing it was for her, and thinking she's in trouble. I hope she does okay. And then I heard the tongue blade. They put this little blade in your mouth, and it holds your mouth open so they can advance the endotracheal tube. And I heard that, and that was the last thing I heard. Then I was out.
Was there a feeling that your light body had, or we could say your astral body, when you were hovering above your physical body?
Not yet, because I didn't realize I had ever been in that physical body,
Oh,
because I didn't have any attachment to that. That's weird that you asked that. I'd never thought about that, but no, like it was just real confusing to me. I didn't know who I was, how I was, if I was any relation to that person, why I was seeing the scene. And it was quick, so I didn't have a lot of time to think about it. But no, it didn't occur to me that I had ejected from anything, or that I was not in a usual form. I just didn't have any affiliation with, I felt like, what was going on there.
Confusion,
Yeah.
trying to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, very much. And then when I came to, not physically, but in the spirit, I was in my sister's car, and she's driving in horrible weather. She was living in Wisconsin, and it was pouring rain, and it was night. And I'm thinking, what on earth? Why is she out in this weather? Then I knew something was wrong, because I'm like, I can't feel the seat against me, and I don't feel as dense as I normally feel. And so I didn't want to scare her because she was driving. And so I would just kind of was hanging out in the back seat, and she pulled over at a gas station. And I remember thinking, gosh, I hope the kids are okay. I hope her husband's okay. Why else would she be out in this weather? And I leaned over and looked at her, and she had mismatched clothes on that were wrinkled. And I thought, what did she get dressed in the dark? She's a redhead. I'm like, why is she even wearing those two things together? That just looks a mess. And she pulled up under this canopy at this gas station and pulled her phone out of her purse and typed in, "Hang on, kiddo, I'm coming." And then I was gone. And she actually had typed that when I came to. I'm like, I saw what you, it was like 3 or 4 days later, I think, when I woke up. Um, I saw what you typed on Facebook, and it totally freaked her out. Like, she won't talk about the story or anything. I don't know why. I'm like, but I described her sitting in the waiting room with my son, and it was a waiting room I had never been in at that hospital. I'd worked at that hospital, but I'd never been in there. And I said,
So that was validating information that
yeah,
you couldn't have known what she typed on her cell phone.
no. And I couldn't have known, even if somebody had mentioned that, I couldn't have known she was sitting in the waiting room with my son, and that there were a row of chairs on the wall, and there was a restroom over here, and there were two empty chairs, then the chair that my son was in, then her purse was between them, and then she was in that chair, and she pulled blue tissue out of her purse, and they were talking about how I didn't have a living will, so they didn't know if I would want to be kept in this state forever. What would my wishes be? And I remember watching that scene and thinking, wow, I wonder where she got blue Kleenex, because I didn't know they sold such a thing. And so I told her about that. I'm like, where did you get blue Kleenex? And it's funny, to this day, we still do not talk about this.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so back into the astral body. So you were in the car, and what happened after that?
Once she typed that in, I was out again. I just had no awareness. like the deepest sleep you could imagine, where you're just completely out, everything's black. And then when I woke up, I was in the void, in the dark place, and I was scared because it was. And I tell people it's so hard to describe. I had a image in my brain of myself in that place, but that place was so dark I couldn't see anything. I couldn't even see my hand, and so I knew I wasn't standing on anything or sitting on anything, or nothing was holding my weight, and I felt like I was weightless. But I still felt like I had some kind of form, and I felt like something was externally pushing against me, but not touching me, like there was pressure. And I kept thinking that it was a lot of work to breathe and that I had to keep working on that. I had to keep trying to breathe. But this part of me knew I didn't need to. I'm like, I don't think you need to breathe here. I think you can just quit that. But I wouldn't. And so it was just this exhausting work to breathe in and out. And I'm thinking maybe I could sense that I was on the ventilator because I was on the vent at that time.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I wonder if that was like a result of, we have these cords that keep us tethered to the
Yes.
body. So I wonder if you were feeling that. Oh gosh, so interesting.
Well, and it's crazy because there's this whole idea, people have a lot of explanations for what they think is happening during a near death experience. And they'll say, oh, it's the lack of oxygen. It's causing all of these like DMT type things to go off, chemicals to go off in your brain. And that's why you're seeing these really, you're having this lucid imagery that is, super bright and colorful. And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, that maybe would explain it if my oxygen levels weren't being perfectly maintained by a ventilator.
Mhm.
So that doesn't explain it. And then they'll say, well, it's the drugs, it's the drugs that they were using to keep you in a coma. Well, I've induced a lot of comas. I've taken care of a lot of patients in induced comas, titrated their drugs to keep them at a certain depth of unconsciousness. And I can tell you, when they come back, when we bring them out, the dreams they have are never organized. They're chaotic. They're like hallucinations. A hallucination is completely different if you talk to people who've had hallucinations than people who've had near death experiences. A near death experience is orderly. The story's the same every time. There may be things they remember or they start being able to grab onto. They had just a hint of it, and then they're able to get more of it as they process the experience. A hallucination is jumbled and weird and scary and maybe euphoric, and none of it makes sense. It's not cohesive. And the person isn't able to tell it the same way, and it fades with time. Whereas a near death experience, my experience is just as clear to me today as it was then. In fact, it's clearer now that I've been
Oh,
able to put
okay. I
words
was
to
going to
it.
ask that. Yeah. Because sometimes, and I know it's not the same thing, but when you were explaining that, I was thinking sometimes, when you have a dream and
Mm-hmm.
it's so vivid, but you have some dreams that it's clear that they're not a dream.
Mm-hmm.
That you traveled someplace during your dream state because you could have experienced it 5 years ago, but you remember it as if it was 5 minutes ago.
Yes.
They're saying that it was, of course, I'm not saying the near-death experience is similar to the dream, but you're saying that the vividity of it, like the vividness, that you could remember it.
It kind of is, though. Are
It
you
doesn't.
like lucid dreams? So I remember
Yeah.
having a couple of those as a child. So I had a dream where I
Hmm.
flew as a child, and I would
Oh
have this
yeah.
dream
Those are so
routinely.
nice. Yeah.
Have you had those? They're incredible.
Yeah, they are. Well, I guess I was saying like a near-death because something was happening to you
Right.
in the physical body. And so you left your body. But yes, I have had lucid dreams, and they are so vivid. They're so vivid, but there is this, and you wake up and you
Yeah.
know you went someplace else.
There's a measure that's it's like that. It's much
Hmm.
bigger, but that is a really good catch on if
Hmm.
someone has had that, it's you can know that it's kind of like what I experienced. Because when I was a
Okay.
kid, I remember telling my friend I had this dream where I flew. I was going to walk off the sidewalk, and when my foot hit the curb, I just flew. And he thought it was crazy. And I'm like, no, on the corner store, there's a frisbee. And it's white and it's faded, and it says seen on it, SEAN. I was a little kid. And he's like, that's crazy. That's crazy. That can't be possible. And he climbed the building, and there was a frisbee up there with the name Sean, SEAN, which I thought was seen. So clearly I had gone out of my body and seen that building. And how else would I have known about this faded frisbee, as a little girl? And so it's like that. And then just throw in, the creator of everything. And and you've almost got it, but it's very, but those are lucid. People remember those and they remember them clearly. I remember what the letters look like on that Frisbee, and I wasn't having any oxygenation issues or anything at the time. So I don't think oxygen explains it, nor do I think drugs. Um, but yeah, so, I wake up, I'm in this void and I'm not happy to be there. And it's really dark and I'm claustrophobic anyway. And so this pressure on me, feeling like I was being, I guess, held down. And I don't know if I could perceive that I was restrained to the bed, because we restrain just about everybody who's in an induced coma so they don't accidentally pull out their tubes. And but I couldn't, there was like physical weight that it felt like was on the spiritual body of mine. And I couldn't lean forward, I couldn't lean to the side, I was able to try to look at my hand, but it was so dark I couldn't see my hand. And I remember thinking, I wonder how big this place is, because it's so dark. It could be teeny tiny, it could be huge, I just don't know. And so I would keep kind of going back and forth between what I would call the deep sleep, where I was unaware of anything, and then this awake, anxious state where I couldn't move and I didn't know why I was there. And I always tell people it was like 10 years in our time is what it felt like. And I'm the whole time I'm there, I'm trying to figure out why I'm there, where there is. Did I ever exist in another place, or did maybe I just made that up in my mind as a fantasy to have something to think about there so I wouldn't go crazy? And then I wondered, maybe I had done something terrible in life and had been forgotten, or um, sent to exiled to this place, and no one was ever going to look for me or miss me, and I was just going to be alone in this place forever, and I could not figure it out. And so this went on and on and on, and finally at one point I wake up, and I decide to lean forward a little bit, and I was able to move, which I hadn't been before. And so I leaned forward, and as I leaned forward, I started to move forward. And I didn't lean forward like at the waist. I leaned forward like this, where my whole body tilted. And then I started to go that direction. And so I leaned back. I was like, whoa, oh, wow, I can move. And I saw light, very faint light, not like a bright tunnel light or anything like that, like light. If there was a house on the street and it had a light on in a room that you could see from the front windows, like that kind of light.
And
And
so the movement was like a leaning forward, gliding movement.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, like kind of floating and propelling forward. And so
Mm-hmm.
I saw that light and I thought, okay, well, let's go that way. So I went that way and I couldn't see anything around me. And I kept thinking, man, I hope I've got room to do this, because I was going faster and faster. And that was kind of exciting. The further I leaned forward, the faster I would go. And I remember thinking this might not be wise, because you don't know, what kind of space you're in. You could crash into something, but what did I have to lose at that point, right? And so I'm flying that direction and I get to that light and I look to my right and there's a room, and or there's something on the other side. And there was a barrier there, and it looked like those thick glass tiles that they used to like put around hotel showers and stuff that
Oh,
distort the.
like the square block ones?
Yeah, you know
Yeah.
how they'll let the
You
light
can't really
in.
see through them, but you can see
Right.
their glass.
Yeah, you
Okay,
could be
yeah.
in there naked showering and no one would know
Yeah,
your
no one could
features.
see it. Yeah.
Right. So that's what it looked like. And I was like, wow, what is this room? And I put my hands to it and it was firm like glass. And I kept putting my face closer and closer. And as my nose touched it, I could see into the room. And there was me laying in the bed. And I knew it was me. And my hands were restrained and I was on the ventilator. And I could see the readings on the bedside monitor, what my blood pressure and all of that was. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm stable, but obviously critical because I'm in a coma, it looks like. By the drugs, I could tell I was in a coma. So I'm looking at the drip rates on the drugs. And I remember I was a nurse. And I'm like, oh, you were a nurse. You didn't make that life up. You were a nurse. That's why you know that. That's why you know that thing. And so I saw that my hands were restrained and that freaked me out. And then my daughter was standing. So if the bed's like this, my daughter's standing in front of the ventilator, but behind my shoulder. And she's wearing this red flannel shirt. And I remembered that it was summer. And I'm trying to think. I went out before my dad's birthday, which is August 22nd. And I can't remember how many days later I woke up, but when I woke up, I was upset because I'd missed his birthday.
Mm.
But I saw her standing there and I remember thinking she's always cold. And I'm like, why is she wearing that flannel shirt? It's summer. And I could see every little fiber that made up the shirt, and I knew how soft it was. I could tell you what it felt like just by looking at it, almost like I could feel it just by seeing it.
I mean, this is really like in two worlds simultaneously.
Yeah, right. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, okay, well, and I tell people all the time, she's a Scorpio, so she's really reserved and quiet, and you never quite, the waters run deep with that one. And I never quite know, I always hope she's okay, but you never can quite tell. And she's just very together, and she manages her business and stuff, and you just don't know a lot of what goes on inside her, and I never have. And we're still close, but it's just that's who she is. And so I felt her feelings. I felt this terror in her that I was going to die, and I had never known her feelings before. And I remember I caught my breath. It was stunning to me to know what she was feeling and to feel it the way she felt it. And so I instinctively put my hands out to pull her into my arms, and my hands hit the wall, and I just lost it. I'm cussing and beating the wall and carrying on. And I'm like, what is this? What have I died? Am I alive? I don't understand what's going on. And the madder I got, the further I got sucked back into the dark and then back into the deep sleep.
Oh, that's so interesting because I was thinking, you said that when you were first in the void, you were asking these questions, and I was wondering if it was your last question that prompted the revealing of the light.
Yeah, I wondered too. I wonder if, as I was starting to, put it together, is this a real place, or have I been exiled, or did I do
Mhm.
something terrible? And I was even feeling guilt, like I had done something terrible. What was this awful thing I had done that would make this an appropriate punishment? It must have been really, really bad. And then that next thing was I woke up and I saw that light. So I hadn't put that together. That's a good point. But I go back and I'm in the dark. I wake up again. I remember how to move. I go right back to the light. And it was funny that rage and anger um, would always shut down my consciousness. So, if I got to that wall and I was rageful or angry, or if I woke up and I was scared and I got angry, I would go right back to sleep. And that
Mhm.
process was stopped. I couldn't just, spin ragefully. And so I go back to the wall, and this time it's like a bubble, and I could see it breathing like a bubble does when air pushes against it. And I'm like, oh, this is different. This is a new development. And it's funny because you're still
This is
funny.
all a new development.
And it's so funny because you're still so you're this goofy. If you're a goofy person, you're still goofy when
Yeah.
you're there. And it's even charming to me to look at that spirit side of me and be like, wow, that's really who God made me to be. It's not, it's not a flaw. So I'm watching this bubble move, and I thought that looks like something I could get through. And so I put my hand on it, and my hand just went right through, didn't break the bubble or anything. And it was on the other side. And I almost, I mean, I was like inches from saying, oh, hot damn, I'm on the other side. I was so excited because I thought, wow, I'm on the other side. I'm figuring this out. I'm making progress. It's not just awake, asleep, awake, asleep. And so I thought, okay, other hand, and so I put my other hand through, and I'm looking at it, and it's on the other side. And I thought, okay, and I just went all the way through. And so now I'm floating above me, and I thought, okay, well, I must just, I'm on this side. I assumed once I got over there, I would just wake up, and that didn't work. And so then I thought, okay, well, maybe I just need to like lower myself and lay down on my body, and I'll get sucked back in. I mean, sounds as reasonable as anything else, right? So I lay down and don't get sucked back in. And I'm like, well, shoot, that's not it. And then I'm up, and I'm not too far from my body, maybe 3 feet. And I'm looking down at me, and I'm like, okay, I think I must have to wake me up. And then when the consciousness wakes up in the body, I'll get sucked back in. And so I'm trying to wake me up, and I'm staring at me, and I'm like, come on now, wake up, just open your eyes, wake up. And she's not doing it. And I'm getting mad. And I'm like, no, 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 don't get mad, because you'll get sucked out. And I thought, okay, you're starting too big. Let's go smaller. See if you can get her to move her finger. And so I'm concentrating on her pinky finger and trying to get her to move it, and she won't do it. And then I'm mad, and so I get sucked back out of the room, and I'm standing there, and I'm like, what are you and I know then that this is something spiritual, that this isn't just some weird dream I'm having, or something like that, some strange spiritual experience. I realized, I'm like, okay, you're very sick. You're in an induced coma. Somehow your spirit has popped out of your body, and you can't reunite the two. And so I knew that. And I'm outside the wall, and then I'm mad at God, and I'm like, what are you doing? Why do you show me that? Why would you show me that? Just let me go back in, or take me out. Why? This is torture. What kind of God are you? And I was just getting mad, and and I was standing there trying to figure out why this would be. Why would this situation come to pass the way it was? And I looked around at the darkness, and I just knew in that moment, it was just as clear as anything. You made this place. You made this place of isolation. What you do on earth, you what you're building on earth, is building up in heaven too, in the spiritual realm. And as soon as I realized that all of the isolation that I'd gone through a bad divorce, and um, he had basically just abandoned me and the kids, and what he had done to the kids was what was excruciating. And I had just kind of built this wall. With every little hurt, I would stack a brick, and pretty soon I felt like I was safe. I was behind that wall. Nobody could hurt me anymore, but I was completely alone. And that was fine with me. I didn't want to be. I didn't want to let people in anymore. And that's fine. But you're building that place on the spirit side too. And you have to work through. Maybe everybody doesn't. I'm told some people just are right in the arms of God. It just wasn't like that for me. And I think he probably sends us each back with a different lesson. I always remind people a near death experience is not a death experience. I imagine it's probably quite different when you go over and the cord is cut and you're not going back to your body. But I think for those of us who have this experience, who God already knows are going to go back, he's building this learning and this story in you that is going to advance you and advance other people. And so I think that's probably why it's so different. And I don't listen to other people's near death experiences because it's so easy to assimilate details, and I never want to do that. Um, but people always tell me, I listen to your story and it's just so much different than every other story. I don't exactly know how, but I think just because they're probably all different, there's some common elements. But
Yeah, I think that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because it is interesting. And I think, we have a tendency to intellectualize everything, even near death experiences.
it's true.
Well, if you didn't see the tunnel, if you didn't see the light,
You
then
didn't see Jesus.
right, then was it really, there's always this questioning, which I just find so interesting, that there's this emphasis, to believe in God, if that's what you choose to call it. But when people talk about their esoteric experiences with the non-physical, there is so much this intellectual aspect overlaid on it. When
Yeah.
you cannot know, how can I know? I don't know what's deeply in your consciousness.
Right.
Know what you're going to experience when you go to the other side. And I have read that where you are in your consciousness is what you will experience upon transition. So it might be different for me,
Sure.
it is for you.
Yeah. It having done so much end of life care, and I've had a couple of patients who have been able to see the other side before their death and been able to talk about it. And I had one patient one time, and his family wanted him to be a DNR, so he was a DNR, but he knew he was going to die, and he wanted to be a no code. And so we'd finally talked the family into it, and they were off in the waiting room, and he was there, and I walked into his room, and I'm like, hey, buddy, how you doing today? And I went to sit in the chair next to his bed, and he's like, oh, don't sit there, my brother's sitting there. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, and so I stood up, and he said, do you see him? And I thought, oh, he's in between, he's in the in between. And I said, I don't, but I believe you that he's there. And I said, it's okay if you're ready to go. It's okay, you can go. And so he dies, right? And we check all the leads that are on, all the EKG leads. He's gone in every lead. I wait a few minutes because sometimes their heart rate will pick back up, and you don't want to freak out the family. And so I wait a few minutes, and I'm like, yeah, he's definitely gone. And so I go and get the family, and his wife comes into the room and just loses it. People do this thing. It's kind of cultural here in Kentucky, maybe other places, I don't know, where they do what's called falling out. So if someone dies, they'll just fall on the floor and they'll wail, or they'll fall across the bed and they'll just wail. And
Oh,
they don't have like the physical strength to hold themselves up, but it's very cultural
okay.
Appalachian kind of thing we see here. And
Mhm.
so she had fallen across the bed across him, and he was just a frail thing. And she's just wailing and crying, come back, don't give up, don't give up. I need you, don't die. And dang if he didn't come back.
Oh,
I felt terrible because here I'd gone and gotten this family, and she's like, he's not dead. He's alive. Look, his heart's beating. And I'm like, oh Lord, help me. And so they go out of the room, and he looks at me and he's like, why did you go get her? And I thought, oh, he saw all of that. And I said, well, I mean, you had been gone, for several minutes. I thought you were gone. And he's like, I wasn't gone yet. And now I'm back and I have to go through all of this again. Next time, don't go get her. I'm so sorry. I messed
note
up
to
your
self,
death.
let her go.
Yeah. So when he did it again later that day, I waited like 20 minutes, and went and got them and, cleaned him up and everything in the interim. And, but I learned a lesson. But, it was interesting that what he saw was a family member there waiting, and he was excited to go. And that was not my experience at all. And I don't know if that's because, he was meant to go and be gone that time and I messed it up.
Right.
And if it had been just a near death experience where he survived a few more years, would it have been different? I don't know. But, despite all of that, I get over there and I realize that is the place I made. That was the spiritual treasure I had built up, was just self-protection and isolation and not letting anyone in for fear of ever being hurt again. And it's funny because I could still be an excellent nurse and do that. And part of nursing is compartmentalizing. This patient's dying in this room and you're crying in that room because it's hard, but you got to be 100% when you go into the next room. So we get really good at shutting off our emotions, probably to where it's not good for us.
Yeah.
And as soon as I realized that, I had built that place, it cracked and the light started coming in. And I mean, just pouring in, just this white light. Like if you sit in front of the window when the sun's out and close your eyes, you don't see yellow light, you perceive white light. That's what it's like. But with no heat attached to it. It's just this bright, intense light. And it starts just flooding in through the cracks of what looked like an egg or something, the way it cracked. Um, and then the spirit comes down. It's this huge grand spirit, and I'm like, oh my goodness, wow, she's huge. And she comes closer and closer to me, and as she comes close to me, I'm pulled into her arms. She didn't touch me, but I'm pulled into her arms, and my head's right at her chest, and I've got my head against her chest, and I'm just ugly crying because there's somebody there. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone, there's somebody here. So even if I can't get across over there, at least this spirit will be here with me. And so I'm crying and crying and like can't catch my breath crying. And all of the shards of the darkness are coming at her, and they're trying to get to me. And, so it was like black pieces of glass. And she had her arm around me at that point, and she would just punch them and they would explode. And then that bit of darkness would be gone. And she just kept doing that until all the darkness was gone. And she tells me, she says, calm yourself, dear one. Cause I'm like shaking, snotty crying at this point, and I did. It was like, if somebody injects you with something to make you go to sleep for surgery and you can't fight that, you feel it taking you. It was like that. And so I calmed myself down, and I'm trying to figure out who she is. And I look at her, and I'm thinking, man, she's just so familiar. Who is she? And then I look up at her hair, and it's this orange hair, like flames on her head. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's my grandma Patrius. It's my mom's mom. And she
The
had
one who
died,
called on the phone.
the one who called on the phone. So we were talking about that before. I'd had this experience when my grandmother died when I was 9, I think, and she had only been sick for a couple of months with an advanced stage of cancer. And after she died, she called on the phone, and I picked up the phone, and it was staticky, and she's like, hello, Penny, can I talk to your mom? And I said, sure, Mom, it's Grandma. And Mom assumed it was the grandmother that was still alive, and it wasn't, and it freaked her out. And it was just a second. They didn't really say anything. She just kept saying, Mom, Mom. And then there was no one there. And so she hung up the phone, and she's like, who was that? Which grandmother? And, she's all freaked out yelling at me. And I'm like, it was Grandma Patrius. And, in that moment, we're like, what just happened here? And my mom was probably taking it the hardest of all of the kids. But there she was. And I was stunned. And I said, I thought you were dead. And I'm a believer, I have this belief that they're there and they're waiting for us, but having that belief and knowing it are two entirely different things. And
Absolutely.
having that now proven, and I'm like, holy cow, you're actually here. I mean, all that stuff that I hoped was true is true. And she's like, well, yes, of course. She's like, there's death. She said, you're either alive in your body or you're super alive in the spiritual realm. That's it, you know. And I was just astonished. And she said, you know this, you learned this in school. And I said, I no, I don't know what you're talking about. And she's like, Penny, you learned this in school, remember? And I said, no. And she says, energy isn't created or destroyed. It just changes form. That's God's law borrowed by man. And I thought of that simple thing that we've all known our whole lives. You are energy. I can measure the electrical impulses in your brain. I can measure the electrical impulses going across your heart. You know, the things that if you get dehydrated, the reason that it can kill you is because the electrolytes, which are electrical carrying elements in your body, get out of whack. And if they're not in the right balance, then your heart won't beat. People don't realize how electric you are. And I'm like, okay, if we can measure your electricity, then you're definitely a source of energy, just like any other source of energy. So why would you be exempt from this law that energy can't be created or destroyed? It just changes forms. You have to go on and exist in some other way, which for all those materialist scientists there, debunk me on that one.
It was so beautifully said. Yeah.
She just was just eloquent with her explanations. And so I asked her if I was dead. And she said, no, you're special. She said, part of you is here on the spirit side and part of you is still in your body on the other side. And there's a cord attaching you. And if you decide to stay, the cord will be broken and you'll be here permanently. That I knew that would be okay. And if you decide to go back, then you'll be back in your body until you're done. And I just, I was just so overwhelmed that she was alive and she was there. I can remember when I was a little girl, I didn't want to go to her funeral. And the lady across the street told me, she said, well, if you don't go to her funeral, she'll haunt you for the rest of your life, which sticks with you when you're, 8 or 9 years old. And so I was always fearful that I would go to her house and she would be there as a ghost and do something to me. And I always kind of thought maybe she would be alive when I went there. Maybe I just imagined all that. And, just kind of, I think kids come to terms with death a little slower than other people do sometimes. But, there she was. And loving me, and her energy was just it was powerful. It was like nothing I could even explain to you. And here it is whirling around us, her energy, but I'm still me. Like nothing that she is taking away from me. And it doesn't seem bigger than me, even though it is. I'm still everything that I am. Like all of the good is just amplified. And I was amazed that I was kind of in a small way in the same realm of being as she is. It's a greatness that she was on that side. I had a little bit of that. And it was crazy. I was like, wow, could I be this incredible spiritual creation? And could I carry that back? That would be crazy. And so finally she leaves. And I don't remember her leaving. I had started crying and she had said, calm yourself. And I was like super chill. And then all of a sudden I feel that shaking and hear that rumbling. And I know God is coming. And it's so me. I'm like, oh crap, that's God. I got to think of something good because she could read my thoughts. I know he can. And I am like grasping. I'm like, there's something good I've done in my life. What is it? What is it? What? And I could not think of one thing. There's just so much pressure, think of a good thing. And I thought he's going to read my mind and I want to have like the good thing in there as though he doesn't know everything anyway. Right. Like I'm going to distract him
to ourselves.
I'm just totally freaking out.
My hair. It's the ridiculousness.
I'm not naked, am I? So he's there, and all of a sudden he's there, and I remember like every thought in my mind stopped, and I don't think I've ever had that short of sleeping. Your brain's always doing something, but it just stopped, and just the grandeur of this creation, and he said, "I am," and I remember thinking, "Yeah, you are." Wow. You really are. That is, and I had heard that in church and in Bible studies, the great I am. And it just, I don't know, it just doesn't mean a lot, I don't think, until you're there and you realize, when he's saying that, he's like, I am the creator of all of this. I'm the creator of the universe. I made you. I set all this in motion. I am that did all that is right here in front of you. And I was just, dumbstruck. Well, what else could you possibly be, right? And there he is, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm with God. And I knew we were going to go through a little life review. I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. And, instead of I'm trying to think of something good, to send him mental suggestions, and of course that doesn't work. And he shows me something good. He shows me this image of me in a grocery store. I tell the story all the time, but I'm in this grocery store. There's a woman in front of me, and she's got a bunch of groceries. You can tell by her groceries. She's got kids. We're going to save a lot. So the bottom rung of grocery stores. And she's short 70 some cents. And so I could see her. She's like, oh, I could see her like pink up and get embarrassed. And she's looking and trying to figure out what to put back. And she picks up moisturizer and, nothing for her kids, just something for her she was going to put back. And I had been that single mom, with 3 kids. And I thought, no, not today. And so I said, hey, I've got the change. Let me help. And she was mortified. She's like, no, 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 it's okay. I'll just put something back. And I said, please don't. Let me help. I've been there. Let me help. And so I gave her the change. And I remember the whole time I'm watching the scene, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm totally unimpressed. And then God shows me the ripple effect of it. And he shows me years later, and she's working in a food pantry, and a woman comes in much like her and is embarrassed because she needs help. She doesn't have enough money for groceries for her kids. And the woman's like, hey, it's okay. I've been there. Let me help you. And he's like, just that little kindness. Look how that went forward. That changed her life. Just sense changed her life. And we always think it's this big thing. We need to have this huge purpose. Why can't I be that person who's this huge public speaker? Or why can't I be, this person who has all this money to change the world? But it was the person with change that changed the world in that moment. And I was like, wow, I had no idea that your purpose could be as small as that, and that it's day to day. It's not always some grand overarching thing. It becomes one once you start living that life. But until then,
day to day.
yeah, it is this day to day kindness and consciousness of what's going on around you and how you need to engage. And so then he showed me the situation with this nurse that I worked with that I couldn't stand working with, because in my estimation, she was lazy. And I'm never one to gossip, but I would
The
harbor.
nurse who you met when you went to the ER?
No, different nurse.
Okay.
And so whenever she worked, I would always have to like check her call lights and stuff, because she would just let them ring if the tech was busy. And it was going to take the tech 20 minutes to get out of a room because she was doing a bath, and that call light was going to go off for 20 minutes. And I just can't do that. And so I would go in and check my call lights, check her call lights, and kind of secretly loathe her, because I was perceiving her to be lazy and ineffectual in her work. And I'm like, these people, all they have is this call light to get help. And when you push that call light and no one comes, it's a scary feeling when you're in a hospital, because you can't do basic things for yourself. And I just understood that. And so I had harbored these really negative thoughts about her, and God showed me her life, and he showed me the things that her dad had done to her, and how he had just tortured her nightly. And still this woman went on to choose a caring profession. And considering where she came from, she was killing it at life. She was doing a much better job than what had been poured into her. And he said, I know you never spoke negatively about her out loud. And that's good, because, words have energy, but thoughts have energy too. And all of this negative that you harbored toward her, that still gets on her, and it makes it harder for her to break out of that and to become more. So you've got to monitor your own thoughts and think blessings on people and think kind things. And when she wasn't answering her call lights, there were things I could have done. I could have said, hey, are you overwhelmed? Do you need some help? Do you need me to check that call light for you? And that might have cued her, hey, I probably should get up and check those call lights. There was a better way to handle it. And I think, right, I think we think because we don't speak something that we're still good people, even though our heart and our minds are full of negative thoughts. And I see this in church a lot.
You're really making some excellent points, because that is so true. I mean, it's the judgment.
It is.
That creates like that dark void.
Yeah.
That box that we keep ourselves in here on this earth plane. And when you were saying, I thought she was lazy, I've heard that so many times in my life. She's lazy, he's lazy, when really you just don't understand. You think you do, but you don't. And it's the judgment that keeps you separate, because you tell yourself a mental story about someone that is often so far off.
It's true. And what does it do? It blocks who you can be to that person. It blocks who they could be to you. And you completely have limited every possibility in that relationship now, because you've caged this person. And I was saying, we see this in church so much. You see people in church and they're like, well, I don't gossip about people. I'm like, no, but I see the look on your face when somebody walks in and their kid has a mohawk, and you're like, oh, I'd never let my kid go to church like that. Blah, not, wow, that family is in church. And it looks like they're doing family different than I do it. And, I need to be friends with them. Not that you need to go in and change their situation, but you need to just open your heart and set aside your own opinions for a minute, and give that person an opportunity to exist, and extend them the respect and courtesy of not prejudging them in your mind. We do it all the time. I see so much of it now. It is so distressing to me. I feel like, we have this truth about ourselves, and we've got a militant group that is trying to shove their truth about themselves down everyone else's throat. It's not enough that they want to be who they are, but they're going to beat you to death if you're not going to embrace it. And then you've got this other group who just assumes that all these people are derelict, and they're just without hope, and there's no solid foundation in how they got to that thought process. Maybe they've been beat down so long that they feel like they have to constantly be thrusting that persona forward, because they don't have any sense of being. For some reason, something has happened where this is all it's about for them. And we have to kind of bridge that gap and say, okay, I see that you're having a very different experience than what I'm having. And maybe they're dealing with it in a way that's non-productive and that is making things harder for them, but you're never going to get through to them by just ostracizing them and calling them all weirdos. And
Yeah.
and I just feel like we've come to this time where no one talks anymore. No one brings up the hard issues. No one challenges any sort of off track thinking, or gives that person even an opportunity to talk about how they got there. And we're all just shutting everyone down, and we can't get anywhere. I was telling people in my podcast the other day, you cannot advance and build up by destroying something. It's just not how it works. You cannot create unity through division. You have to talk to each other. If I have a problem that is causing division between you and I have to come to you and say, look, I might be perceiving this totally wrong, but I feel like this is, under the water, what's going on between us. Can you help me with that? Because I don't want to have division between us. And you're going to say, wow, I had no idea that's how you perceive that. That wasn't what I mean, 9 times out of 10, that's how it goes.
There has to be a willingness to even have the thought.
Yeah.
Is a better way.
That this person may be doing things in a way that you think is crazy, but that doesn't make them without value or purpose. You just might need to work harder to help them find it.
That's true.
And they might just be going about it the wrong way. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You might just need to kind of soften them a little bit. But anyway, so I get there, I'm with God. We go through the good, we go through the negative, and there's this point where I realize I'm going to have to surrender to him to some extent. And I don't know if I want to do it. I don't know if I trust him. And, but I decide, okay. And I always tell people, it's like getting naked. And if you married later in life, or you're on a second marriage, you didn't meet that person when you were 20 and everything was where it used to be. You meet them when you're in the lingerie department shopping for devices to hoist things back to where they used to be, right? And it's kind of like, you've gone out on this date with them. My husband and I, we've been together 12 years and I'm 52. So I was in that position. And I remember the first time that I was thinking, I'm going to have to get undressed in front of this person and he's going to know all my secrets. The girls will hit my knees and he'll be like, what? How did you make them look right? But that's what it's like in front of God, even though he knows you. But still, there is that self-consciousness in us. And I just felt like to let him in emotionally was to be naked like that in front of him. But I was like,
gosh, so much of this is like just what you're experiencing in your actual real life. And you're seeing it and feeling it in the non-physical, just showing you.
I'm finally facing it.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, kind of like jumping into ice water, here goes. And this light just started swirling around my feet. And then it came up in my body through my calves and up through my thighs and up to my middle. And I could feel it going around all of those internalized pain and trauma that had not been resolved in my life. And I could feel it going around my heart and softening that hardened heart, and I could feel it coming up through my neck and coming out of my mouth a song. And I could never sing. I still can't sing. I wish I'd brought that one back, but just beautiful music. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is who you are if you really open yourself up and let that love of God into you. You know, everything that comes out of you is bound to be more beautiful just because of who's stirring it, you know. And so then it comes back up, it gets behind my eyes, and I'm like, oh, it's going to come out. So I squeezed my eyes shut, and it shot out my eyelashes, and the light hit everything around, came back in, went in through my brain, and I could feel it going through the little curves, and I could feel myself knowing all the things that I never knew, all the things I didn't even know I didn't know. And then as soon as that light would leave that spot, that thing would be forgotten. And I'm like, oh, I'm not going to get to keep all of this knowledge if I go back. It was such a
Very
bummer.
nice.
You know, I really wanted to hang on to the answers of the universe. And so then there came this point where we were going to go on this journey together. And I had to just totally surrender to him, and I couldn't do it. And I was like, you know what? You say that you love us and that you care about us. And, you know, if that's true, then why don't you help us? You know, I'm calling BS. You saw what my kids were going through. You saw their dad promise to send them stuff and then them go out to the mailbox to get it every day, and that mailbox is empty. Those were children. You know, you could have interceded, you could have helped them. And he said, oh my goodness, you've completely misunderstood me. Let me show you. And so he shows me the scene, and I'm in the soccer field with my son. My grandson, who was 2 at the time, is 5 in the scene, and he's running up and down the field, and he's so tan, you know, and the sun's just on him. He's just so full of life and beautiful. And my son's sitting next to me, and he looks at me and he says, Mom, I'm going to be the dad to him that I deserved. And I was like, oh, oh, you're going to break this chain of broken families through my generation. You're going to do that through my kids. And I thought, wow, this has been hell. But we'll take one for the team, you know, that comes after us to break that, and to have good fathers in this family who stay with their kids, you know. And on their dad's side, it was just a hot mess, and a lot on our side too. And you know, here I've got kids that are wonderful parents. My son is just sold out, dedicated to his kids, and God did break that through him, even though he doesn't believe in God. You know, God is still doing that work in him, and I think it will come to pass. And so once I knew that, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm all in. I'm all in. Let's go. And so we're kind of, he's like holding on to me. He doesn't have hands, and people will say, oh, but you didn't see Jesus. And I always have to address it. Bridgitte, if you were to come to my house and knock on my door, when I opened the door, I would just see you. I wouldn't see you in your spirit. You know, I wouldn't see your body, your mind, and your spirit as separate things. And God is a 3-in-1 creation. You know, God is the mind, the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit, and Jesus is the body. Up there, they're not all 3 separate people anymore. They're all together. I imagine they could appear as 3 separate people because people have seen that, but they're also that 3-in-1. We're designed in that image. We're 3-in-1. You have a spirit. I can't see it, but I know it's there. I can sense it. You know,
You're talking about oneness.
Right. And I'm like, so just because you don't see Jesus in a near-death experience doesn't mean that, you know, you were seeing Satan, because people will say that. They're like, oh, that light was fooling you. That light is Satan because you didn't see Jesus. And I'm like, you realize God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are 3-in-1. They're a trinity. They're one thing. So if you saw God, you saw Jesus, and you saw the Holy Spirit. You guys just haven't put that together yet. And that's okay, because you've not been there, and it's a lot. So anyway, I didn't, you know, I'm there with God, and we're going to go through my DNA, through my chromosomes, and I can see us going through this pattern of what made me. And we're going faster and faster, and I can feel these strands going over my skin. And we get to this part, and he just stops, you know, hard. And he's like, do you see me? And I said, yeah, I see you. You're all around me. And he's like, no. Do you see me? And he points into my genetic code, and he's there. And I was like, what? And he's like, I'm there. I'm in you. I made you. I'm your father. People deny who their fathers are, but you can do a DNA test and you can find out who their father is. I'm your father. I am in here. I knit you together. And I always thought that was just like a saying, you know, I knit you together in your mother's womb. I'm like, oh, well, yeah,
When you
that's
hear
nice.
I am light, I am love, like it's,
Yeah,
but it's literal.
it's literal. It's in you. There's a video I
Yeah.
saw on Rumble the other day. I can't remember who did it, but they talk about the genetic code, and he talks about how the first 3 letters in the genetic code, if you match those up to either the Hebrew or the Greek letters, it actually translates to Yahweh, which is the sound for God. And they do the intonation of that sound. And as soon as I heard him say that, I'm like, you're right. He is in there. He is in your DNA. You may not realize it yet. You may not believe that you were created by something bigger than you, that you're just happenstance. But, let me tell you, there is nothing perfect that ever comes from happenstance. You can't just throw a bunch of things together and then something perfect walk out of it. It just does not happen. This idea that we all crawled out of this, primordial ooze is foolishness. I'm like, if I show you a book and I'm like, hey, look at this book with this beautiful cover. Um, we just put a bunch of pages and some, ink on a table and we just waited. And pretty soon, look, we had a book. It's so cool. I'm like, no, it has an author, it has a creator, it has a designer. There's intelligence behind it. There's intelligence behind you. You were made. You're here on purpose, for a purpose, for such a time as this, And people just, if they could get their arms around that, they're like, this isn't an accident. I'm here because God wanted me here now during all of this craziness that's going on. There's something important that I bring that is world changing to this world, to this situation. And everybody, I feel like, has kind of gone into isolation mode. They've crawled under their rock. They're like, this is nuts. These people are crazy. And no matter what side you're on, both sides are calling the other side crazy. And they are out of their minds. And I'm like, really? Really? Do you think half the population is just absolutely insane? And there's no saving them, and they're not here on purpose, for a purpose, maybe just going about it in a way that's not productive. And if you hide under your rock, how much longer is that going to go on? If you don't extend love and understanding to people and say, hey, there might be a better way than trying to get this done through destructive means. There might be a better way. Your voice might resonate a whole lot louder if you were exuding love, because people are drawn to that. I'm not drawn to somebody who's just screaming hate, or calling people names. And that's what I feel like we've just been reduced to, the lowest level of communication in this country right now. And I'm like, no, 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 no. That person that you think is crazy is exactly the person you need to go and be kind to, because they really think that you're a certain way. I mean, I've had people talk to me and they're like, wow, I would have never thought these were your beliefs. I would have never thought you were a Christian. You're so nice. Isn't that sad? And I mean, I've had a lot of people that are struggling with their sexuality will come to me and they're like, hey, I hate that I can't have a relationship with God because he finds me disgusting.
Well, when you were talking, I was thinking, because you were saying the light that you saw, that you were shown in your DNA, is the light that's also in my DNA. It's everybody. We all have this, but there is this this feeling of unworthiness.
Yeah.
So it makes it hard for some people to find connection and love, and some people are having a hard time even connecting with themselves.
Yeah.
And since it all starts within,
Yeah.
it's affect what happens outwardly.
That's a good point. I feel like on all sides of the debate, there are people who just don't feel like they have a voice anymore, or feel like they're lost. There are people that handle that either by being overbearing, or just shutting down. And I really want to encourage the people who feel like they need to be overbearing and constantly screaming what their situation is or what their belief is, to kind of tone it down a little bit, and remember that there are people that exist outside of you, and that the whole world isn't about you. I think, if anybody could like grasp onto one truth, it's not about you.
It's about all of us.
It's about all of us. There's a bigger thing going on. And if the way that you are pushing the things that you believe is causing significant pain to other people, you need to rethink your approach. Or if it's causing destruction, I just think Martin Luther King was the most beautiful example of conflict resolution to us. I mean, I do. If I had one person I could sit down to dinner with, it would be Martin Luther King Jr. I'm like, what strength of character do you have to have people violently in your face and to say, I will not return violence for violence. I will not return hate for hate. I will share the love that is in me, that is put in me by the Creator, and that will change the world. I might not be able to do it, but God in me will change the world. And it did. It did. I grew up just outside of Detroit right after the race riots. And I remember my mom telling me the story, and we lived in a very diverse area. And I remember my mom telling me the stories, of Martin Luther King and the march and all these different things. And the little girl that had to go to the school who was so scared to go to school there, and people were so cruel to her. And they're so caught up in their own ideology. And instead of trying to understand, they just yell louder and they hit harder. And I'm like, wow, if you just softened it just a minute, think of the possibilities. Are you not even willing to engage in the idea that there could be a possibility of unity here and not division? Are you dedicated to the division? Because I think some of us are. I think some of us are dedicated to dividing. And I'm just
That's a
telling
good
you,
point. Yeah.
it's all gonna crash and burn if that's how we go about it. I have to understand that that person needs love just like I need love. And that person may be going about it in a way that's not constructive, but that's something I kind of know how to help with. So I just feel like there's so much for us in some of these near death experiences, especially the ones that kind of realize that, there are evil forces. I always tell people, you're not fighting your neighbor. You're not fighting the person on the other side of the town. You're fighting powers and principalities. You're fighting this duality that exists between darkness and light. And people get sucked into that. People aren't that. They get sucked into it. And sure, they can get sucked into it to an extent that it's very difficult to get them out. But I think most people with patience and love can come out, and they can work together, and we can come up with common solutions.
Yes, common solutions,
Yeah.
collaboration. So when you saw the light in your DNA, was that it? Like, what did you?
So I saw this light and I realized he was in there. And then I knew that if we went any further, I was going to have to stay and the cord would be cut. And I was like, dang right, cut that cord. Let's stay. This is awesome. And I knew as I was thinking it was wrong. And I realized, and it was going to be okay. There wasn't going to be, any fallout from me making that decision. It was my decision to make. But I knew that I had not lived to my fullest potential and that I had just shut down. And for most of my years after that divorce, I hadn't lived at all. And I had shut down all possibility in myself of the change that I could bring in the world. And, part of me was really struggling at that time because I had lost my career and I had always wanted to be a nurse. I knew since I was a little girl, I wanted to go into healthcare since my grandmother had died. And when that was gone, I just didn't know what to do. And I can remember, coming back from that experience and thinking, you know what? Not everyone gets an opportunity to recreate themselves at your age. You have things that you are good at, you have gifts, and you can now pursue those where you couldn't before because you were having to work 4 12s a week, and now you have this opportunity. And are you going to just squander it, or are you going to change the world? Even if the world doesn't realize you're changing it, you could absolutely be changing it one person at a time.
Absolutely.
And I thought,
So
I got to go back. I got to try.
you went
Can
back.
I go back? Can I let the love of God flow out of me and get all over everybody who's around me? And I'm like, I don't know. That sounds super scary. That sounds really vulnerable. But I feel like if I don't try, I'll have wasted it. And
Mm,
so I'm like, okay, I'm going to go back. And I woke up. There I was in the hospital room, the nurse sitting right there next to the bed because they just extubated me maybe 20 minutes earlier. And I was just coming out of the sedation. And I looked at her, and the first thing I said was, I was with God. And she's like, oh, that's nice, dear. And I'm like, no, no. I mean, I was with God just a minute ago. She's like, let me go get your family, And
That's
I'm like,
sweet.
yeah, that's so nice. Isn't that cute? So they all come in. I tell them the same thing. She's like, okay, maybe everybody should go and we should let her rest a little. And the term ICU psychosis was thrown around. I remember thinking, or maybe I just saw God. Um, but then she leaves and she turns the lights off and she pulls the glass doors in the room, pulls the curtains and everything. And God pops into the room, and it scared me and I yelled. And he laughed. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought you were gone. And he's like, I'm never gone. I'm God. I'm like, well, I know, but you don't just pop into the room like that. And so he laughed and I laughed. And he's like, I want to give you a message and I want you to share this with the world. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like just right now, you're just gonna what is that, right? What am I gonna do? Share it with the world. And so he gives me this message, and I have no way to write it down until the next day. But I remembered it perfectly, wrote it just out of a coma off of fentanyl and the drug that killed Michael Jackson and Versed. I mean, all kinds of drugs that should inhibit your memory. And I remembered it perfectly, but I didn't share it for a really long time, for years. And when I had my last near death experience, I had two. The first time I coded, and then the last time I coded. And so when I went back that last time I told God, I'm like, I can't do this anymore. Just take me or heal me. I can't keep doing this. It's destroying my family. You know, we live in perpetual fear that I'm going to die, and nothing is helping me. And the doctors aren't giving us any real hope or answers. And I can't do it anymore. And he says, it's not me, it's you. I was like, what? And he said, it's not me, it's you. You said you wanted to live. You said you were going to go back and you were going to let the love flow out of you and onto other people, and you're not doing that. And I was incensed. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm dying every other week. I'm in a hospital in a coma 18 times in 2.5 years. I mean, I'm unconscious more than I'm awake. And how would I do this? And he's like, you have to start saying yes. When an opportunity comes to you, or a person, I put somebody in your path, you have to say yes. And I'm like, you're telling me that if I say yes, that's going to change all of this. And he says, yes. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds totally
That's
ridiculous,
a
but you're
message for
God.
everybody. Say yes, be open, receive, and give
Right.
simultaneously.
Right. And, you know, we talk ourselves out of it. You'll have a
Yeah.
thought, you'll be like, oh, I feel like I should go over and talk to that person, you know, who's really struggling because their kids, you know, behaving terribly or whatever, and just extend some mom love to them. You know, oh man, I remember my
Mhm.
kids were, and we talk ourselves out of it. And it's every day. Watch, I always tell people, before you start trying to do it, monitor how often you talk yourself out of it. How often something in you says, do this, say this, and you talk yourself out of it. And you'll be amazed how many opportunities you pass up
I
in a
know, that's
day.
a great point. Great point.
Because you got to know how often you say no to figure out how much yes you could say.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so I just feel like I'm back in that situation. And he says, you know, you've got to do it. It's got to be you. And people are like, oh, so your illness was psychosomatic. And I'm like, no, but that's an interesting thought. I think people think that because you changed the state of your spirit or your mind, that whatever was wrong with you wasn't a real thing. It must have just been psychosomatic. And I'm like, you can't psychosomatically go into respiratory failure. It's just not possible. You could have an anxiety attack, maybe, but you couldn't shut down your own airway. And I'm like, no, it was a real physical problem measured by labs that showed wildly off base things that should not have been. Like, I think I had a IgE level. I think it's not supposed to be over 300, and mine was running between 7,000 and 10,000. And that's a measure of how reactive you are allergically. And
Wow.
so we knew something was going on. But I came back from that experience, and my friend Brian, who has the channel called Grief to Growth, he lost his daughter. He just lives up in Cincy, and he had been talking to me for a long time and asking me to come up and speak to their IONS group. And I kept saying no and lying, making up reasons I couldn't do it because I have such social anxiety. Um, and he called me or messaged me when I got out of the hospital, and he's like, hey, would you like to come speak to? And I said, yes. And he was stunned. And I'm like,
So
just
that
don't
was the
say,
yes.
yeah, don't say it. And that
That
was,
opened the door.
yep, Brian Smith was my first yes. I owe him my life because he gave me that opportunity right away before I had time to think about it. As soon as I got home, I think if I'd had much time to stew on it, I would have thought that's ridiculous. That's not going to work. And I would have talked myself out of it. But because God put that opportunity, as soon as I walked in my door and sat down, I
So
couldn't
the
say
yes
no.
was to say, to be open to speaking about your experience, to really coming to the forefront, because it's not easy
Yeah.
about stuff like this because of the reason you spoke about, the skepticism,
Yeah.
you know, your credibility, all that we lay on it. But here you are
Yeah, I know. Right.
sharing with everyone this profound experience.
I would have never believed in a million years had you told me, you know, when I got hurt at work, don't worry, you know, in 10 years, you're going to be podcasting several times a week and thousands of people will follow your story and 1.7 million people will hear about a near death experience. I would have been like, yeah, that's crazy. But it is amazing. Just that little step of saying yes has done all of that. It's not anything in me besides a willingness to get God's love all over everybody, you know, and to kind of try to shake people out of this crazy time that we're in. And we have these crazy times. These aren't new. I want people who are just so despondent and feeling like, I mean, I know people who are just not leaving home or are waiting for death because they feel like times are so crazy and we're never going to get back to any kind of even keel. And I want you to know that that's only going to get worse if you stay in your house. And that's only going to get worse if you don't engage. You've got to find some people who have the same passions as you and put those passions to work. if we're going to pull out of this. And we've gone through times like this in our country of real darkness. I mean, we were talking about Martin Luther King. Look at the civil rights movement, what evil was going on, before one man was like, enough, enough. I'm one man. I'm the last man anyone wants to listen to because I'm Black. They may kill me for it. And he did it anyway. He said, yes, what the heck? How, think about that. Think about if you had the bravery of that man today, if you stood up and you knew something was wrong in your community, and you stood up and you knew you were the last person anybody would listen to about it. You had no credibility. Maybe you have a dark past and you just decided, I'm turning over a new leaf and I'm going to do it. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say yes. And you made the decision in your mind that even if everyone calls me crazy, even if it results in my death, I'm going to get God's love all over each other, and God's love is going to change the world. I guarantee you're going to be successful.
Well, I was just thinking, as you were speaking, so much could be taken away from your experience. I mean, there's so many exceptional points you make based in truth, regardless of how someone may see this or feel about it. And I was going to ask, what is the one takeaway that you would want people to take away right now? And I think you just said it.
Yeah.
Stand up, speak your truth.
Yes.
Do what you need to do, bring the love. Every day, day by day, moment by moment, just be the love that you can be right where you are.
Exactly. Exactly. Don't talk yourself out of it.
It has been such a pleasure to hear your story. Penny, you related with such eloquence and candor.
Thank you.
Thank you so, so very much. I mean, there's so much in it. I mean, to not block the good, to say yes, to be open, to have a willingness. There is another way.
Yeah.
Be open to the fact that there is another way. Look for it. And if you can't see it, create it.
Yeah. And you know what? If you don't know what to do right now, because I know a lot of people are just spinning. They're just like, my husband is spinning. He has no idea what to do. And I'm like, support the people that you feel like do know what to do. Get behind their movement. Try to be a pivotal person in helping them get the word out, or them do whatever activity that they're doing to try to change it. And then you become part of this bigger thing. Because a lot of people are like, well, I would have said this too, though. I could never do a podcast. I could never go and do public speaking. A lot of people say that, but then, if you support someone who does that, then every life that is changed because of that effort, you are a part of. And it's huge. Every time I see some good thing happen that I've had a little, maybe I donated to that, or I sent a prayer to that person or something, I'm like, oh my gosh, that win is partly mine. What God's kingdom is rejoicing that all of these people were behind that. And it looks like one person carried the flag in, but it wasn't. It was that person on our shoulders carrying that flag in. So if you don't know what to do, support those who do.
Beautiful. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to this conversation with Penny Wittbrodt. I sure did. Penny Wittbrodt was invited to write a chapter for Dr. Penny Sartori's book, The Transformative Power of Near-Death Experiences. Penny is currently finalizing her first book, A Life Reclaimed. She can also be seen on Amazon Prime in Craig McMahon's documentary, Life to Afterlife, Death and Back To. You can learn more at withealthcoaching.com. Thank you so very much, Penny.
Thank you.